Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, we're looking at Egypt, where most of the voices in the media are lining up behind the military government, and those who do not are getting much less airtime. Kenya and the legislative fallout from the siege at the mall in Nairobi. There are new rules for the media, and reporters don't like them. What's with all those Israeli journalists abandoning their media jobs and moving into politics? And commuting the boredom sentence of the New York City subway conductor. In our web video of the week. When Egyptians turned on their televisions this past week, they saw someone they haven't seen in more than 4 months, their former president, Mohamed Morsi. Morsi was in court, charged with incitement to cause murder. Some journalists were allowed in, but they had to check their phones, cameras, and recording devices at the door. It was a carefully choreographed media event which gave Egyptian state-owned media control over how much attention Morsi would receive. That is, as little as possible. Since Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood were ousted, almost all domestic media have supported the transitional authorities. The voices of dissent are growing quieter, and the government's backers seem to lack a sense of humor. Political satirist Bassem Youssef's show, which is huge in Egypt, was recently pulled minutes before it was due to go on the air after Youssef mocked the public fervor for the Egyptian army. His channel, CBC, which stood shoulder to shoulder with Youssef when the Morsi government went after him, wasn't willing to do that this time around. It suspended his broadcast. Our starting point this week is Cairo, where the army holds power and the bulk of the Egyptian media seem happy to march in step. The Arabic word for hysterical is hysteri, and multiple Egyptian newspapers, including Al-Yum Al-Sabi and Al-Masri Al-Yum, used that word to describe Mohamed Morsi in his first court appearance. Al-Watan went off script slightly, saying Morsi had a screaming fit. Egyptian newspapers are popular, but in a country with a literacy rate of just over 70%, television packs by far the biggest punch, and that's where the real change has occurred.
What they've done in terms of controlling media coverage is, of course, that they've already shut down most Islamist media outlets, and also the framing of the trial. TV was running on a loop footage of some of the violence by pro-Morsi protesters that was basically a montage of duplicity and violence by the Brotherhood. So the entire establishment media is very much framed as he's already guilty.
The state television was the only television network that was permitted to release videographic content from the trial. Conversely, there's a private newspaper called Al-Watan, which has taken a very strong stance in support of the interim government, and they too were given an opportunity to produce leaks from the trial. So in a sense, it's an attempt to architecturally steer public discourse around the trial in a particular direction without appearing to be muzzling the media.
One private channel called On TV delved into the former president's state of mind with a psychologist, a long-distance diagnosis, and a little gossip.
في حاجات أنفق الدكتور مرسي إن من مصادر موثوق منها إن الدكتور مرسي بيعاني كان من نشاط كهربي زائد، وبالتالي هو بياخد الأدوية اللي هي مضادة للنشاط الكهربي.
On TV is where satirist Bassem Youssef got his start before moving to CBC. Youssef was a hero in Tahrir Square for mocking Mubarak-era politicians and the media outlets that supported them. He kept that up under Morsi, was repeatedly threatened with legal action, but CBC backed him and never took his show off the air until he skewered Egyptians for their support of the army.
تابعت شبكة CBC ردود الفعل الشعبية التي أعقبت عرض الحلقة الأخيرة من برنامج تقديم الإعلامي دكتور باسم يوسف، والذي جاءت في معظمها رافضة لبعض ما جاء في هذه الحلقة.
Bassem Youssef's show was pulled off the air because he dared poke fun at the military, not at the defense minister directly, but he made fun of the blind idolization of the defense minister. How women have been swept off their feet. So I think he dared venture into ground that was untouchable. Authorities want to keep the military in that sacred place. It's the new red line, as it had always been pre-revolution.
The content of the episode, I don't think it was trespassing on any one person or even the institution at large. I think the Egyptian people can live through that, and I expect them to come back, even if not with this network, with another. And I think that's important for the Egyptians. Freedom of expression is the basic right.
The Listening Post requested an interview with CBC on its decision to drop Yusuf's program. We were told that Managing Director Mohammed Hani asserted that CBC, as well as many other Egyptian media firms, boycott Al Jazeera. Like Bassem Youssef, Al Jazeera was widely popular with the Egyptian people in the days of the Tahrir Square protests. And like Youssef now, that is no longer the case.
Al Jazeera is currently viewed, I think, with a lot of hostility in Egypt, and that's because there has been a concerted campaign against it by other media in Egypt. It's been associated very strongly with the Muslim Brotherhood. And Al Jazeera Arabic in particular can be perhaps fairly criticized for having been biased towards the Islamists.
الحاصل أننا اليوم يبدو أنهم تورطوا في الاستعجال في عقد هذه المسرحية الهزلية التي لا أسميها محاكمة.
Unfortunately, the Al Jazeera network has become sort of persona non grata in Egypt, airing a disproportionate amount of content in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the response in Egyptian society has been absolute condemnation, complete boycotts. Many of them have decided that they will not interact with the Al Jazeera brand in its entirety.
Many of the people who filled Tahrir Square demanding political change and a free media, many Egyptian journalists who covered that story, are the very same people now willing to curtail media freedoms. The argument they make, that echoes across the airwaves, is that stability matters more now than the freedoms that people fought, even died for then. That's a tough call. But even if they did get it right, the question Egyptians must ask themselves is, once freedom of expression and freedom of the press are surrendered in the name of stability, how does a country get them back?
Egyptians want a real path towards a democratic political process where you can vote politicians in and vote them out based on their work. And the media has to always be the eye on all of this and fourth authority on all of this.
For the most part, journalists will have to wake up a year from now and realize that the manner in which specific events was covered in these last few months has been problematic, and that one needs to do their job in a professional way without the fear that the country is going to collapse or disintegrate.
If this is going to be a genuine democratic transition, there needs to be a free media, and this can only happen if journalists themselves say no to censorship and take a stand. Without that happening, I think we will lose it, and the culture of fear will return.
Our Global Village voices now on the state of journalism in post-Morsi Egypt.
While I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the media would have won freedom prizes under Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, there can't be any doubt that the media in Egypt is failing to hold those installed in power by the coup accountable for their actions. Now, that's partly because journalists have been arrested and the junta has shut down TV stations, but also the state media is playing its own role in helping to toe the army line.
On one hand, the Brotherhood clearly threatened the media outlets. We've seen them besieging the media city several times, threatening to kill anchors openly. They threatened to close many media outlets, which they believe they were biased against them. On the other hand, the current regime, with the rising sense of nationalism, depends on self-censorship, which portrays them as someone who believes in freedoms, which they don't.
We're always looking for new faces for the program. If you'd like to share your thoughts on the news media as one of our Global Village voices, you can get in touch with us on Facebook or send us a tweet. Our Twitter handle is @AJ Listening Post. And don't forget our free video podcast on iTunes. Just go looking for The Listening Post, Al Jazeera English, and you'll find us there. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The Kenyan media have been crying foul over a new law that gives the government extensive powers to restrict or punish journalists, and the country's president seems to be listening to them. This story goes back to that deadly siege at that shopping center in Nairobi. The Kenyan media, including the privately owned KTN news channel, showed footage from the mall after the Al-Shabaab hostage takers had been removed, showing soldiers looting, targeting mobile phones in particular. Then the police tried to pressure the journalists who broke that story into revealing their sources, and they threatened to arrest the reporters. On October 31st, the government passed a new media law. Any journalist found to have committed misconduct can, under that law, be hit with fines as high as $200,000. They can also be banned from working anywhere in the media. Journalists all over the country oppose the legislation. The biggest selling newspaper there, the Daily Nation, gave it front page coverage and a headline saying, "No, Mr. President." President Uhuru Kenyatta has since promised to look into what he describes as the gray areas of the law. International press freedom watchdogs are also keeping an eye on this story. The New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, through its East Africa representative Tom Rhodes, said this draconian bill realizes the media's worst nightmare, where government makes itself both judge and jury of what journalists say and how they say it. Two officials from an international media freedom organization have been expelled from Sri Lanka, with the authorities there accusing them of anti-government activism. Jackie Park and Jane Worthington, both Australian, are with the International Federation of Journalists, the IFJ. They were arrested October 30th during a workshop with Sri Lankan journalists from the Free Media Movement, the FMM. The two were questioned for 2 days before being allowed to fly home, but only after investigators had erased all of the information from Ms. Park's laptop. Arriving back in Sydney, Park described the motives of her questioners. From the kinds of questions that we had over the 2 days, she said, it was clear it was kind of a witch hunt against the local media. That was echoed by journalists in Sri Lanka. FMM leader Sunil Jayasekara told reporters, "We have very serious doubts about our own safety and that of independent journalists." Press freedom and human rights in Sri Lanka are sure to come up when the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting starts in Colombo, November 10th. Sri Lanka ranks near the bottom of the Press Freedom Index compiled by Reporters Without Borders, 162nd out of 179, alongside countries like Kazakhstan, Rwanda, and Saudi Arabia. Both French forces and Malian police are continuing an investigation into the murder of two journalists from France who were abducted and shot dead while reporting in northern Mali. 57-year-old Ghislaine Dupont and 55-year-old sound technician Claude Verlon both worked for Radio France International. The two journalists were last seen alive on November 2nd when armed men bundled them into a vehicle outside the home of a Tuareg separatist leader whom they had just interviewed. French forces found the journalists 2 hours later. They had been left on a desert track outside the town of Kidal, which is the birthplace of the uprising that plunged Mali into chaos last year. Dupont and Verlon, both highly experienced in difficult reporting conditions, traveled to northern Mali despite warnings of the risk involved in a region where rebel forces have regrouped since the French military intervention earlier this year. In Paris, President François Hollande called the killings a despicable act. His foreign minister, Laurent Fabius, described them as cold and calculated assassinations. 9 months ago, the new Israeli parliament was sworn in, and there were a lot of familiar faces, not from the world of politics, from the media. Roughly 1 out of 10 members of the Knesset are former journalists. And we're not talking about mere backbenchers. The leader of the country's second most popular party is Yair Lapid, and the leader of the Labour Party is Shelley Yachimovich. Both came out of the studios of Channel 2. Having made their careers scrutinizing the nation's politicians, more and more journalists are, with the help of voters, infiltrating the Knesset. Israel's link to journalism goes way back. Before becoming the father of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl was a journalist. He wrote a column for a newspaper in Vienna. And by the 1950s, much of the Israeli press was dominated by party-owned newspapers, with many members of the Knesset doubling as full-time writers. But what is it about Israeli society today that more and more journalists are cashing in on their high profiles, trading reporting for politics? The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now on what this trend means for governance in Israel and for the media.
Throughout Israel's relatively short history, media and politics have been closely intertwined. Perhaps never more so than in the current crop of journalists turned politicians, sworn into the 19th Knesset. a bunch of polished MKs who have applied the well-honed communication skills they learned in the field of journalism to another field, politics.
There used to be generals in the Knesset, then lawyers, and now journalists. I think it has to do a lot about the change in Israeli society. These elections are like the like elections. You either like the candidate or you don't. It wasn't about parties. It was, will I vote for Yair Lapid or will I vote for Sheli Yachimovich? The parties were out.
The changes that took place are in two ways. One, in the political realm, where parties became less important. And what happened in the last 10 years is that this objective, independent media has changed its nature. And the Israeli journalists became very much opinionated, like the Americans, like Fox and MSNBC. So they do put forward their positions, and suddenly you realize that these are not neutral professionals, but politicians in different costume.
Yair Lapid is definitely an example of personality politics. In 20 years, we saw the rise of the journalist or media person as a celeb. And once that happened, party politics went down and personal politics, popularity politics went up. So the two things merged in a way and gave rise to the possibility that a journalist or media person who is a celeb could go quickly and efficiently into politics, and that is definitely evident with Yair Lapid.
Lapid has made the move to politics look easy. But take a look at this. Back in 2005, he interviewed another journalist turned politician.
האם שווה לזרוק קריירה תקשורתית כל כך מצליחה בשביל כל הגועל נפש הזה?
Then he did exactly the same thing. Lapid gave up his anchor chair, formed his own party, and ran for prime minister.
These are the facts.
Now he's Prime Minister Netanyahu's chief coalition partner, the finance minister. But what does crossing the line mean for a journalist's relationship with former colleagues?
When I left my paper, Haaretz, my friends, journalists, were offended. They saw me as a traitor. I changed family. I divorced my first family. So you're asking me a question. You left your wife for someone else. Did she like it? Of course not. It's the same.
All of a sudden, you're judged differently. The trend to cover politics very cynically, which is harmful to politics in general, is also very personally felt by journalists who have crossed to the other side. Mickey Rosenthal from Labor is a very good friend of mine. We worked together on the same show. We had a conversation about the fact of how we turned from 20 years of being courageous journalists fighting the establishment to being corrupt politicians, part of the establishment, and that happened in a blink.
Many journalists spend their careers covering, analysing, skewering Israel's politicians, sometimes even skewing what they say. Clearly, they consider journalism the ideal training ground for politics. They think they know how politics works, but do they really? Does knowing the Knesset from the outside really prepare one to work on the inside?
Absolutely not. And I can tell you that because I was a journalist and I became involved in politics. The relations between journalists and politicians are very close. But if you talk in general terms, journalists know, but it doesn't mean that they are good politicians. We live in a world where someone who knows nothing and didn't do anything in his life suddenly wants to be a prime minister.
They are underprepared for office. I think that at the end of the day, Yair Lapid can be a wonderful journalist, and he was a wonderful journalist. He's a very, very talented writer. He takes nothing, he leaves nothing to chance. But at the end of the day, he has no clue about finance.
It's moving from being a spectator to being an actor. I have written extensively for 25 years. I thought, maybe naively, that by moving to the action, I would change the face of Israel, which turned out to be wrong. It's not as easy as I thought.
It didn't work for Daniel Ben-Simon, but that has done nothing to deter other media types from invading the Knesset. Israel is a country with mandatory military service, where one's record in the army traditionally paved the path to parliament. But that's changing, partly because ex-military personnel must now stay out of politics for 3 years, an obligatory cooling-off period. When some MKs tried to pass a similar bill for journalists, it was rejected. The line between politics and journalism is becoming increasingly blurred. And as more and more people cross it, the Fourth Estate in Israel is facing questions on its role as a check on power.
When Sheli Yachimowicz interviewed Amir Peretz, who was then the head of labor, in 2006, and about 2 months later, he welcomed her into the Labour Party. So people said the interview was, very soft and very complimenting because she was already planning her move into politics.
איך התחושה להפוך בן לילה לסוג של יקיר תקשורת בשיא הטרנד?
Now there's distrust and basically I think it's a positive thing.
Obviously, when a journalist moves to politics, he hurts his own profession. Because they say you have a hidden agenda. It is a major problem, and unfortunately, most of my friends left journalism to politics in a matter of a few weeks, which is a prostitution of the profession. That's why journalists and politicians are the least trusted professions in Israel.
That was confirmed in a recent study by the Institute for Israeli Democracy on public trust and state institutions. At the very bottom of the pile, journalists and politicians, separated only by Israel's religious leaders.
The Israelis do trust the military, the security forces, the Supreme Court. They get about 80–90%. And the media, the Knesset, the parties, they get about 20, 25, 30%. So the Israelis don't trust the media and they don't trust politicians.
Perhaps that's because today's journalists tend to become tomorrow's politicians. It's a revolving door. Although most of the traffic in Israel is heading in the same direction, in search of power.
More Global Village voices now on the increasingly well-worn path between the worlds of journalism and politics in Israel.
I don't think that journalists are well prepared to be politicians. I think that as journalists, they are required to sit on the fence and criticize whatever they see in front of them, and not to take the real decisions that the government has to take or that any political figure has to take. But what they do have is a brand. They are well known. Everyone knows their faces. Everyone thinks something of them. And I think that this is what happened in Israel when we had some kind of a leadership vacuum.
The notion of the fourth estate, I think it's an invention. I think most of the media people are connected to politicians and they're not playing their role as the checks and balance. There's not objectivity in the media, it's all subjective. Hence, I don't think that they're betraying their role. I think it wasn't their role to begin with.
Finally, in the days before the World Wide Web, all kinds of people would quietly go out of their way to make someone else's day, but relatively few people ever knew about it. That's all changed, and this next viral video is an example. Being a subway conductor in New York City has its monotonous moments. Part of the job requires conductors to point at a black and white strip at the center of each station platform to confirm that the train has, in fact, stopped at the right spot. Well, a couple of New Yorkers chose to brighten up that mundane moment by standing underneath those strips, holding up a sign, and getting a laugh out of the conductors. It's one of those little things that has somehow racked up 1.2 million hits online so far. The New York subway sign experiment is our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.